Maine's top election official has decided to remove former President Donald Trump from the state's presidential primary election ballot. This makes them the second state to disqualify Trump from its 2024 primary ballot. The move comes after Colorado's Supreme Court ruled on the issue last week, citing Trump's role in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Maine's Democratic Secretary of State writes Trump's actions around January 6th compelled her to rule him ineligible. However, officials say the decision will not be enforced until the courts weigh in on the issue. Trump plans to file a legal objection in state court. This as Minocqua Brewing Company owner Kirk Bangstad files a complaint with the Wisconsin Elections Commission to attempt to bar former President Trump from the Wisconsin ballot. Right after the filing, the commission announcing it tossed out the complaint. In a statement, the committee wrote, "The complaint was rejected without consideration as WEC cannot make a formal judgment for a claim about the agency itself." Therefore, the commission tells WMTV 15 News it recuses itself.
This organization was created to specifically not be able to decide that because they have 3 Democrats and 3 partisan Republicans on the committee who will not be able to vote on this in concert.
Now, Bangstad has told WMTV 15 he plans to file a lawsuit in Dane County Circuit Court early next week.